Hello and welcome to the Budget Briefing, your guide to Budget 2023 with me, Sorcha Corcoran, and in association with EY Ireland. After the 11 billion budget announcement from the Minister for Finance, just how will the country be impacted as we head into a difficult winter and a looming recession? To help cut through all the detail and find out what it really means, I'm delighted to be joined by economist Jim Power, plus Kevin McLoughlin, EY Ireland's Head of Tax, and David McNamara, EY Ireland's Director of Economic Advisory Services. You're all very welcome to the show. If I could go to you first, Jim. It's fair to say this is an unprecedented budget for Ireland. What is your reaction to it overall?
In absolute terms, it's the largest ever fiscal package we've seen. If you include the 300 million that's been used from the Brexit/COVID contingency reserve fund, it's an 11.3 billion package, and 6.9 billion of that on the core budgetary measures, and the rest then addressing the spending and taxation measures of once-off nature. So it's incredibly large, and if you look at the detail of what was delivered yesterday, it virtually covered everything. You know, there was a real scattergun approach, and it's difficult for very many people to stand up and say, well, actually, I didn't get something out of this budget. Okay. I think that in the circumstances, you know, obviously cost of living was top of the agenda in setting the budget. Obviously, the very uncertain global economic outlook and the fact that interest rates are rising significantly, the fact that the UK is in a lot of turmoil at the moment, and obviously the performance of sterling has implications for Ireland. We've seen the cost of doing business here, particularly for the SME sector, energy related, increasing significantly. The climate change agenda, although it didn't get mentioned very much in the budget. And of course, the other area was, well, the other two areas, childcare and housing. So there was a lot of different areas addressed in this budget, but it was pretty much a scattergun approach, particularly on the spending side. You know, listening to Michael McGrath delivering the expenditure part of the budget yesterday, I couldn't keep up with the pace at which he was giving out money for various projects. So it was like Santa at a Christmas party, you know, incredible stuff. But I guess in the circumstances, you know, the political reality is that, and the economic reality indeed, is that all of these issues had to be addressed. And that's what the budget was all about. One final point I would make is that 3 weeks ago, the government was suggesting that the once-off package would be 3 billion. And then Sinn Féin came out in its alternative budget saying it to be 3.8 billion. And lo and behold, the package was 4.1 billion. So I think this budget really has to be seen through the political prism. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, Kevin, what do you make of it? Do you think it went far enough? Has it gone too far? And did the government get the balance right in terms of?
Yeah, I think it's. Yeah, I think, clearly I think what the minister was trying to do was balance the need to appear to be prudent and not spend, all of what was a very, very large projected surplus. I think what he tried to do as well is try to strike a blend of, supposedly one-off measures and, more permanent measures, so that I suppose on the basis that some of the one-off measures could be rolled back next year if they're not needed in the following year. And I think to make a meaningful difference then, I think, in people's pockets. And I suppose if you looked at it in terms of business, I think, again, I think there was very targeted support for business, particularly around the cost of energy, which I think would be welcome. I thought it was interesting, actually, that there was a reference to competitiveness and the need for Ireland to remain strongly competitive in the years ahead against the backdrop of potential for change internationally. And I think finally on the business side, I think business would certainly welcome the kind of continued support for incentives, particularly in the innovation space around R&D and knowledge development. And I think for households, again, I think for most households, it'll vary obviously depending on the degree of income involved. But I think There's certainly quite potentially significant tax cuts for individuals. I think, again, direct support and significant support on energy bills. And I think, to Jim's point on the welfare, the spending side, significant support promised in the areas of childcare and education. So I think, yeah, very, very significant. I think Jim used the word unprecedented, and certainly from my perspective, he had the biggest budget that I ever recall. So.
Yeah, David, what did you make of it all in terms of balancing the here and now and long-term considerations, which we discussed last time?
Yeah, I've been it's that mantra of mine for the last couple of weeks, to previewing the budgets, suggesting it would be about the here and now, and it really was that. Very little mention of sort of the long-term challenges like climate, like the aging of society, like the challenges in healthcare and all those other areas, and opportunities as well too. So unprecedented, I think, is definitely the word of the day. I was trying to figure out the size of the budget package in terms of the size of the economy. So outside of the COVID years, I think it's the largest budgetary adjustment we've had since 2009. Now, of course, 2009 was the opposite. We were actually taking money out of the economy. Yesterday's was worth about, I think, somewhere between 4 and 4.5% of GNI star, which is a measure of the domestic economy. Back in 2009, we had about a 6% adjustment of GNI. And remember, we had two budgets in that year. We had an emergency budget when things started to fall apart in the global economy. So a really significant adjustment. One-off measures, as Jim said, are important. Sometimes it's difficult to roll back one-off measures. How quickly do energy prices reset or come back to normal levels? The government may have to return to this early in the new year, just as they did earlier this year with the energy credits. So I think the bigger and I suppose broader picture is as important. Like I mentioned in our last conversation, we've seen the financial market reaction to the UK budget on Friday. And I think the lesson here is that governments no longer have a free pass with fiscal policy. They've had one for the last 10 years because central banks were just buying up their debt in the secondary markets. And it kind of didn't matter what they did as long as they were keeping their electorate happy. All of a sudden, we need to be cognizant of the risk to our borrowing costs. And the Irish 10-year bond, there was no reaction to yesterday's news, really, by and large. Irish bonds moved with the rest of the European markets. But we just need to be careful as a globalized economy over the medium term. And that's why I think it was important that the minister laid out his plan to actually bank some of those corporation tax receipts in the National Reserve Fund. Could have probably gone further, and I think he needs to lay out a medium-term plan over the next couple of years as well. But I think it's an important signal, and credibility is quickly lost, and it's hard won on the other side of it.
Okay, and Jim, would you agree there that it was the right thing to do to bank that 6 billion into the National Reserve?
Oh yes, if you look back to 2007-8 and the run up to that period, one of the big mistakes we made on the public expenditure side was to spend aggressively on the back of tax revenues that proved transitory. In other words, tax revenues were driven to the stars by the construction and property sector. Government spent that money on that basis, and suddenly when the property and construction sector collapsed, we were left with a massive hole in the public finances, because once committed to, it's incredibly difficult to roll back on public spending. So if you think about where we are at the moment, yesterday's budgetary package was a big expenditure package, and the reason why yesterday's budget actually was possible, and this is what differentiates us, I believe, from the UK situation last Friday with the mini budget. After the changes, we're still looking at a budget surplus of 1 billion this year and 6.2 billion next year. Okay, so we're in other words, we're not running deficits to inject this stimulus into our economy, and I think that's really important from a market credibility perspective. But I guess the reason why it was possible is because of the tax revenue buoyancy. And I have argued for years, and I constantly get involved in ideological debates about, economists being accused of caring only about the economy, don't care about society. I have always believed in this ideological debate that a functioning economy is absolutely essential to generate the resources to fund public expenditure. And what we've seen over the last couple of years has been a remarkably well-functioning economy that has generated remarkable tax revenue. And it's those tax revenues that enabled the Irish government to deliver an 11.3 billion package yesterday, while at the same time budgeting for a small surplus this year, a bigger surplus next year. But the key message then has to be that spending on the back of a corporate tax take that's likely to hit 21 billion this year, up from 15 billion last year. There is a huge question mark, obviously, over how the permanency of that tax base. So I think it is totally appropriate that money be put into a rainy day fund in the event of that tax take disappearing or falling significantly at some stage. There's no guarantee it will, but the global risks are obvious in that regard. So I think the rainy day fund is a good idea. The one slight reservation I would have about it is what is the definition of a rainy day? And the fear would be that at some stage in the next 2 or 3 years, for political reasons, the incumbent government will deem current conditions to be rainy and will use that funding for political advantage. So I really do think with a fund like that, you need to copper fasten it to make sure that it is only used in a situation of crisis.
Okay.
I think in the best scenario here would be the minister laid out how much of the corporation tax were excess, and he said 8 to 10 billion. Now they have information from revenue that the general public won't have, and they'll understand that what's excess and what's sustainable. So I suppose what you'd like to see would be that we get to a point where we're banking all of that excess in a given year and not using any of it to spend, even if it's only going on one-off measures. Once we get over this exceptional situation, that all of that excess is going into that rainy day fund or reserve fund, and as Jim said, it's copper fastened. And it be treated like the Norwegians treat their sovereign wealth fund, where all their oil and gas funds go into, because that's essentially we've struck proverbial oil and gas here with the corporation tax receipts that we've received over the last few years. Nobody expected it, and nobody knows what the outlook for the future is. So I think I'd like to see us set out a plan where we actually bank all of those excess receipts in the medium term.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kevin, just can we zone in now on the cost of living measures? I'm specifically interested in the business energy support scheme. I mean, how is that going to work, and will it have enough of an impact? And also, I think there's a little bit of vagueness around what businesses can actually apply for this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the devil is definitely in the detail on this one, but I think in its terms of its general thrust, it is clear that it is aimed more at the small and medium enterprises rather than necessarily every business equally, because there's a monthly cap, if you like, on what businesses can claim. But I suppose the starting points for businesses to kind of, and this will be done on a self-assessment basis. So business needs to look at its kind of unit costs 2021 versus 2022. If those unit costs are at least 50% higher in 22 than they were in 21, then the businesses are eligible for relief. And that's the first step. I think once they're eligible for relief, the actual relief then is 40% of the increase year on year. So that's essentially the benefit that businesses are entitled to, but subject to a maximum of 10,000 a month. And I think it's pretty clear that in that sense, while most businesses will qualify depending on what the movement has been in that unit price, it will be capped. So I think that's a way of, trying to disproportionately favor small and medium businesses. I think the interesting thing is that in terms of the administration of this, the revenue commissioners, well, it's not tax as such. The revenue commissioners is the body that have been trusted essentially to kind of implement this, and that's probably a recognition of the success of the temporary wage subsidy scheme, which again the revenue were intimately involved with, if you like, in terms of its administration. It probably proved that they were the most adept at actually getting cash into the hands of businesses or taxpayers last time around. So, but there's obviously a little bit more detail to follow, but those are the main points of it.
Okay, and Jim, can you just talk us through what you see as the most important aspects of the cost of living measures for households? and what that impact that will have on the wider economy?
Well, yeah, I mean, we saw a number of initiatives like the double child benefit payments, the double social welfare week, the Christmas bonus is going to happen in early December, the €600 electricity credits, 200 of which will be applied before Christmas, and the other 2 installments of 200 each sometime in the new year. So there's a lot of money thrown at these cost of living measures. And basically what they will do, or should do at least, obviously depending on what happens energy prices over the coming months, but hopefully, you know, they will compensate people for the extra expenditure that they will be have to engage in as a result of higher energy costs. So, you know, people are, I've heard people complain that following the budget, they won't be any better off. The way I would look at that is that without this budget, they could have been a hell of a lot worse off. You know, there would have been a huge financial deficit in their personal finances. So a lot of money is being directed towards addressing these cost of living issues, and it's 4.3 billion or thereabouts. So it's a very, very significant package. There is no guarantee that it'll be enough, because the one thing I would certainly say about everything at the moment is intense uncertainty. We have no idea. I've rarely felt as bereft of any sort of direction on where we're going over the coming months as I do at the moment, because there's just so much stuff going on globally. And of course, much of it is being driven by geopolitics, and particularly the actions of Putin.
What I'd add to what Jim is talking about, I think there is a risk that we look at, say, the measures here that are directed to individuals and businesses as two separate things, but they are linked. I mean, the supports that are geared towards, say, energy costs for businesses fundamentally around keeping businesses open and keeping people employed, if you like, because again, while the focus has rightly been on corporation tax receipts, again, I think the minister was at pains to say yesterday that there's also been buoyancy from in terms of income tax and indirect tax, which reflects the fact that the employment market has very much recovered, if you like, since COVID. So as I say, it's important, I think, to kind of keep the linkages between all of these measures close in mind.
Definitely. And David, can you compare, if you wouldn't mind, this budget with what the UK are doing, and whether what we're doing is better or not?
Look, I think maybe whether it's better or not, I suppose it depends on where you stand in terms of your ideological outlook. But I think the markets have given their a strong verdict on the UK budget. Jim put it really well at the start, where he talked about, you know, us continuing to run a surplus this year and next year, whereas in the UK you have a budget which was, you know, put together probably very quickly because the new leadership was there only a couple of weeks, and the tax cuts were unfunded. So there was no plan to reduce spending to pay for these tax cuts. They were all financed by increasing debt. And there was also an energy cap brought in the UK, which was an open-ended commitment by the UK government to support households and businesses, as rightly they should be doing. But there's a lot of uncertainty with that. And again, it's all funded by debt. And I think that probably the cherry on top was the cut in the additional rate of tax, the 45p rate, for high income earners. It doesn't bring in actually a lot of revenues to the UK exchequer, but I suppose the symbolism of it, I suppose, was quite important, and it seems like it was a very unpopular move. And I suppose all of that together, combined with the fact that their fiscal watchdog, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, were prevented from producing a forecast which would give an independent view of actually what these policy changes would do. So it was essentially a shot in the dark in many respects in the UK budget, and the markets have now given their verdict. Sterling declined very sharply at the back end of last week, recovered somewhat, but the real action was in the bond markets, particularly the long-dated bonds for the UK sovereign. And now you've seen the Bank of England have had to intervene this afternoon essentially to turn on the printing presses once again and to start that quantitative easing, buying UK government bonds on the secondary markets to bring down the cost of borrowing. So very uncertain, and I just think it's a salutary lesson for policymakers that, as I said at the start, there's no free pass now. Central banks are winding up or winding down their exceptional monetary policy support, and really, market participants and investors will be watching fiscal plans very, very closely in the next couple of years.
Indeed. Kevin, can we talk about income tax for a moment? The top rate of tax being raised to 40,000, for example. What is your reaction to the various income tax measures?
Yeah, I think Jim used the word unprecedented at the start, and I think that equally applies to the extent of the increase in the bands. So again, if you think about the last number of years, the bands have increased very, very, in a very small way, largely to reflect what at the time were probably very low levels of inflation. But I think to increase the bands by essentially over €3,000 has the effect that for people who are at the upper end of those bands, who are at 40,000 plus, the tax savings alone would be €600 just in terms of the bands, and then all of the tax credits were increased universally, €75 each. So again, depending on your circumstances, the actual tax benefits at the upper end could be €700 to €800. Obviously, they would be a little bit lower for those who are in lower incomes in that regard. But I think even there, I think there's a threshold for universal social charge, I think, which was increased by just short of €2,000 there. Again, I think to try and put some relief at that level. But yeah, I think really significant. And if you kind of add the benefit of the kind of subsidization of energy bills, which again was €600 spread over 3 months, the combination of those and the tax measures, if you're at that upper band, are over €1,200-1,300. So very significant in that sense, and certainly far more significant. You'd have to go a long way back, I think, to find that level of benefit from adjusting some of the tax measures that were announced yesterday.
Right, yeah. And Jim, moving on to housing, as we said last time, you always scratch your head about housing policy. What did you make of what Pascal Donoghue said yesterday about housing and the various things that have been introduced?
Okay, the first thing I was led to believe about a month ago from political circles, which proves that my political contacts are not great, was that there would be a strong focus on addressing the exodus of private landlords from the private rental sector. Okay, and there's a lot of data showing you the exodus that has been occurring, particularly since the introduction of the rent pressure zones. Okay, so I thought they would address that, but in the event they didn't. And I suspect the reason is because of the controversies that have grown up around politicians with rental properties. So I really believe there was a strong political element there, but that's me speculating, I guess. But looking at the measures that were introduced, I mean, the Help to Buy scheme will continue at current rates until the end of 2024. I think that's probably, I think it is a good move. Taxpayers paying rent on their principal private residence will now get a €500 per year tax credit. So that's definitely going to help renters. But however, it does nothing to address the supply. And there's always a danger in a market where there's restricted supply. If you stimulate demand, you're just going to push prices up. So I'd worry about that measure. But renters, I guess, to a limited extent, will welcome that. The only real measure for landlords was the amount that landlords can claim in pre-letting expenses per premises being doubled to 10,000 from 5,000, and the period for which a premise must be vacant has been reduced from 12 to 6 months. So that really was the only measure to help landlords, and I don't believe the measure was sufficient. I don't believe it will arrest the exit of private landlords from the market. And okay, people will argue, well, if a private landlord exits the market, somebody will buy that property. So, how is that a bad thing? But I think housing has to be seen in a holistic way. It's not, it's affordable housing, it's social housing, it's owner-occupied housing, and it's rental housing. They are the four elements, and all four need to be given due attention. And if a private landlord decides to sell a rental property, okay, obviously somebody will buy that property, so a house doesn't disappear. But where it does disappear from is the rental side, and it just exacerbates the existing pressures on the rental side. And people might say, well, are the institutional landlords coming in buying a lot of rental properties anyway? But the point is that a lot of these private private rental properties that are being sold are not in areas where institutional investors will come in anyway. If you think about a small town in Ireland where a private landlord decides to exit the market, institutional investors are not going to come in and buy that property.
No.
So I would have welcomed some measures to try and arrest that decline in the number of private landlords in the market.
David, can we just briefly talk about the green agenda? There were some measures talked about yesterday. I mean, it doesn't come close, obviously, to what we need to be doing. Just give us your insights into what was said yesterday and where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think it was marked by the lack of references to the green agenda or climate or so I think probably, I mean, I haven't been following the reaction since the announcement yesterday. The climate NGOs, what their reaction is to it are different other stakeholders across Irish society. But there are a lot of plans. I think it's important not to get lost too much in what's announced on budget day, because, for example, the minister will announce an 11 billion euro package, but, we're spending tens of billions every year. So we also need to look at the government in the round and what they're doing already. And there's already been a lot of supports and incentives announced to get us towards that green transition. I would have liked to have seen something more to accelerate that transition, particularly given what we've seen with the war in Ukraine. And essentially, Putin has weaponized his monopoly on fossil fuels and fossil fuel supply into Europe. So we need to see that acceleration. We're seeing that across Europe, and I think that's good news. For example, the level of solar power was up by something between 25 and 30% during the summer months in the EU. So already people are getting the signal that price signal from high fossil fuel prices is being hammered home, and people are making the switch and businesses are making the switch. So would it be nice to see more? But I mean, I'm not surprised, given it's about energy security and providing people that certainty to get through the winter months. But we need to, if we get over this period, we need to kind of redouble our efforts. As I said before, I think in our last conversation, the Fiscal Advisory Council have kind of said, the climate action plan isn't fully costed. And I think, the government can't do it all. We need to find ways to actually crowd in that private savings. There's a huge amount of savings in the household sector and the corporate sector. How do we actually put that to good use towards the green transition?
That's all we have time for on this episode of the Budget Briefing. My thanks to Jim Power and EY experts Kevin McLoughlin and David McNamara for joining me on this year's series. I'm Sorcha Corcoran, and thanks for watching.